Hi, my name is Cecilia Pounard, and welcome to this episode of Brave New Women. All around the world, there are amazing, ordinary women doing extraordinary things. Brave New Women is about giving those women a platform and a voice, and it's about changing the way that women are perceived. And it's a way of inspiring all of us to do the things that we've always wanted to do. I'm absolutely thrilled to welcome Camilla Borrevik to the podcast. Camilla is a social anthropologist. She's working at the University of Bergen in Norway. Last year, she finished a PhD in climate change, and she was looking in particular at the effect of climate change on the Pacific island states, those small islands that are scattered all around the Pacific. And she's currently working on a research project on the consequences of sea level rises for the Pacific island states. That's a multidisciplinary project with different with people with different expertise who are working on that subject. So it's extremely topical. And the first question I'd like to ask you, Camilla, is how did you get into anthropology? How did you get into climate change? Where did your interest in those subjects come from?
Thank you. First of all, thank you so much for finding my story interesting and letting me speak on your podcast. So, in order to understand why I got to where I am today and with the areas of focus that I am, reflecting back, I guess I've always loved to travel, and I've always I've been fortunate to travel a lot with my family, and I've always loved learning about people and different societies. I think we have a lot to learn from each other. So that's a bit of a round way on how I ended up in the Pacific and with anthropology. So maybe not everybody knows what exactly social anthropology is, but social anthropology is basically the study of human societies. And we base a lot of our research on ethnographic fieldwork, which means we spend a lot of time in a place we're researching to learn about it. And I've spent a lot of time in the Pacific, which sort of started by accident, really. During an exchange program in my undergraduate, where I spent 1 year at the University of Hawaii in Hilo. And that's sort of where I really was introduced to the Pacific region and Pacific studies. And I got a lot of my Pacific friends that I still have today. And what I found interesting and just fascinating about the Pacific was, it's close to a third of the world. It's, the world's biggest region. And I didn't really hear much about it.
In terms of surface, you mean?
Yeah.
Of the world.
In terms of Pacific Ocean, the region of the world. Yeah. And not hearing much about that here in Norway, and Norwegian venturing out, traveling to the Pacific. So that's what really sort of triggered my interest. And social anthropology was just a brilliant way to get to do that and actually to go to the Pacific. And little did I know that, at the time that would shape and define the next couple of, 15 or so years of my life. So, as you said, last year I finished the PhD looking at the social and political consequences of climate change. But I've also worked with various actors who've been concerned with Pacific issues, such as EU and UN and academia and others. And that sort of led me to where I am today. And the work that I just started is doing research on the consequences of sea level rise as part of this interdisciplinary project, as you mentioned. It's called Mare Nullius, and it plays on inspired by the term terra nullius, meaning nobody's land, right? And it's led by a very prominent Pacific scholar here at the University of Bergen. So, we're a team of anthropologists, legal scholars, and climate scientists, all sort of working together to get the different aspects of the physical, the legal, and the human consequences of sea level rise.
Mm-hmm. What does it actually involve? Have you spent a lot of time in the Pacific as a social anthropologist? And what does that actually involve? What do you do every day?
Yeah, so as a social anthropologist, you do ethnographic fieldwork, right? So that's an ethnographic fieldwork is quite interesting in itself because it's both the method used, but also the data that you're left with to analyze after. So that basically means that you spend a lot of time in the place or close to the subject that you are doing research on. So for me, my PhD was based on research carried out in various Pacific countries. So I spend a lot of time in Palau and going back and forth to Palau quite a bit as well.
Where is Palau for those who don't know it?
Yeah, so Palau is, northwest Pacific Ocean, so close to the Philippines. So it's part of a sort of sub-region of Pacific called Micronesia, which translates into small islands. But then I've also done research in the Solomons and Solomon Islands, which is further south Pacific, as well as Fiji, which also is more southern. And in Samoa as well, only though for attending a large UN conference on the small island developing states, one that is held every 10 years, and it just happened to be in Samoa when I was there. And then I've also done fieldwork a lot at the UN climate negotiations. So there I've been part of the delegation of Palau as a representative of their delegation, which has been an extraordinary opportunity, and especially, looking at these social and political consequences of climate change that I've been focusing on. It gives you that being able to go in Palau and do research on climate change there, and as well as going to these UN climate conferences. It really gives a much broader sense and view of how climate change is experienced, how climate change is thought about, and how it is dealt with in very different ways. So, from the ground on the international level. So it's a very sort of hands-on way to do research based on these fieldworks, which are quite long. So in total of, a 5-year period of a PhD, I spent 18 months doing fieldwork, which is quite a lot because, it takes also a lot of time to come back and to analyze and to sort of establish what you've actually been part of and what you've seen, and obviously also doing the interviews and to analyze those and the literary research and so on. So, and
what's an actual day like when you're doing research? You're in Palau. What is it? Palau. Palau, and then you wake up in the morning, and then what do you do? You have your breakfast, and then what happens after that?
Yeah, well, it depends. Maybe it's hard because you make your own day in a way, and you're very dependent on other people. So a lot of the day goes to sort of either run after people, having meetings with people, talking to people, but also learning by doing. So participant observation, that's called. So you're really participating in everyday life. So in Palau, for parts, I was living with Palauan family, and just gaining an insight into Palauan daily life, as is. But also, they have their work and they're going off to their jobs and things like that. And then it's up to me to sort of to find out, what else is going on there. And for me, that involved, for example, going out to places like villages, locations where, for example, sea level rise was a huge issue, understanding, just the daily impact and experience of living with the sea sort of flushing towards your door, right? Because it's a very unique experience, and a relationship with the environment that, at least for many of us, we just wouldn't know how it is to live with that fear of a flood or a storm surge or a cyclone coming in. So that could be one day, and I could also attend various conferences or different processes connected to climate change. For example, creating climate change policies and the meetings that they had there to understand how they do that, which is also highly relevant for understanding climate change in that sense.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And so in your PhD, you were just talking about different levels of knowledge of climate change. So can you just talk a bit more about that? And I understand what you mean is that people are looking at the issue from, the person who's got the sea, who's just, watching up to their door and is worried that there's going to be a major storm and that, their house is going to be flooded, to the people who are in the UN conferences who are talking about this at a much more theoretical level. So maybe if you could tell us more about that.
Yeah, so in my PhD, I approached and I guess analyzed climate change as a sort of a multi-level and multi-scalar social and political phenomenon in that sense. So meaning, looking on the ground how it is actually living with climate change, but also nationally through, for example, policies, as well as regionally. The Pacific Islands have had developed this big regionalism based on climate change. It's really been sort of a force for stepping up as a region, getting this up, especially then taking that up on international level. So to the UN climate negotiations, for example. So there you have these different levels and scales and kinds of knowledge through, climate change experiences, policies, projects, documents, and meetings, and so on. So it sort of reflects some of what I see as a big problem with climate change, is that, it's a global challenge, but it has highly different local impact. So that means people's experiences of climate change may also differ quite a lot. And the second problem, connected to this is that the international climate regime often sort of separates out or maybe ignores, or at least it's not included. They sort of separate out certain forms of knowledge and insights just through the way that it's set up. And what I wanted to do was to explore why this is happening, or at least how. So when talking about different forms of knowledge and different levels of knowledge, I'm particularly then thinking about, for example, like I mentioned, experiences of climate change representing one kind of knowledge, but then you also have local environmental knowledge, indigenous knowledge, while you also have the scientific knowledge about the models of climate change, climate change projections may represent another kind. So all of these are very important if we are to understand climate change, and especially if we are to act on it, right? So what I find interesting here is, I guess, also the practices of knowledge sharing. So meaning the ways that we share, for example, experiences or or science for other purpose. For example, in all these climate change projects or in policies or at global negotiations. And I guess also the way that things are set up at the moment, in many ways, we sort of fail to share, especially the lived experience of climate change and the realities of climate change and on Pacific peoples. It's very crucial to get across. So that's in one sense. I can also give an example if
that'd be fantastic.
Yeah. So to give an example of what I mean by I guess practices of knowledge sharing is these climate change projects in lots of Pacific communities by a major donor sets up a climate change project, for example, to raise awareness about climate change awareness. That's a very sort of typical thing that you hear all over. And say that the project is, for example, funded by the EU, and so the Pacific community and the local community would need to then report to the EU. So the project person goes on the ground, does a survey, and gives a presentation to local people about climate change impacts, maybe does another survey to sort of see how many people are reached. And so what goes into these reports? And that's where it sort of gets interesting, because I've followed all of these processes, right? So I've been part of, from the setup to the information gathering and then what actually comes out in the report. So what goes into these reports and is being sent back to the EU, a lot of the time it doesn't really give information about people's really unique experiences of living right next to the sea that rises and causes massive destructions after storms and floods. And really the kind of uncertainty that it has for their lives and for the future of their countries. If we're talking about atoll nations, the sea level rise predictions are horrible, right? So this really shows that the information that goes in there is of a different kind, and it's in many ways already decided ahead in a way. So often we can talk about it as ticking the boxes, right? But although many reports are much more than that, but the report then describes the project events, the survey results, often in the form of numbers of the people reached, to see if the project was a success and how many people have now been made aware of climate change. But the people missing out or actually not being aware, those sitting in Europe, for example, who get back a report not containing really in-depth knowledge about climate change from Pacific perspectives, but in a way they get back what they expected to get back. So, yeah, and
predetermined knowledge. It's almost
exactly.
Because what I'm hearing, what would be really interesting is just to have it almost like stories, stories of I was sitting on my porch and there was a huge storm, and I could see the sea rushing up, and just stories of how people are actually experiencing it. It sounds like from what you're saying that the people on the ground, they don't need climate change awareness. I mean, it sounds like they're perfectly aware of what's happening. It's not awareness doesn't sound like it's the right word. It sounds like what they need is help. They need someone building a wall or to be, doing something practical to make sure that, what actually are they going to do when the sea levels rise?
Mm-hmm. Well, obviously, I don't want to portray it. So obviously there are projects that go more sort of in depth on actual practical solutions like that. But it is also, it's the way that climate change discourse really has been shaped these past decades of it's an irony to be made aware of climate change when you're living with climate change, and rather it should be the other way around. It should be getting the stories from on the ground outside. And the same with climate science, although we definitely need climate science, but the current discourse on climate change, which is heavily dependent on science, often also has this sort of a globalizing instinct. Some academics have argued in that at least it leaves out also these stories, right? And it sort of it gives more of a global projections, and even the regional projections are quite broad. So they're not particular in that sense. So there's really all these different knowledge sharing experiences and practices that we sort of have to be aware of, because those are the forms that shape also our decisions, the way we make decisions. And from my point of view, the more insight we have to, the stories, the actual climate change stories and Pacific climate change stories, the more we would be able to get better decisions that would, make it safer for them in the future and for all of us, basically. And it's interesting that you mentioned stories as well, because stories is, it's not just, a story is knowledge in the Pacific, and where you're coming from also defines your story. So what they also talk about a lot in the Pacific is sort of these climate change stories, that they also need to get those out and those experiences. Because a story is place privileged knowledge, and that's a very defining part of many Pacific Islanders' cultural lives as well. So the story is a place, and it's your identity. And if that place is under threat, that also means that your identity in life is under threat. So it's sad, but a very sort of, when you get into the way that knowledge is shared like that, it's very fruitful and important.
Is sharing those stories part of your role, or is that distinct from your role?
So I guess that's for me, that's been a big motivator, I guess. As a Norwegian working in the Pacific, I think I have a responsibility to share what other people, Pacific people, have shared with me about their experiences and about the effects of climate change and the various effects of climate change. It's not just physical, but obviously if you've experienced a storm and had to run for your life on multiple occasions, that's something that really gets ingrained in your mental state as well, right?
Trauma, major trauma.
Yeah, trauma.
Yeah.
So in that sense, I do feel like I have a responsibility, and also I hope that my PhD sort of can, in its book form now, we don't know how many will read it, but at least it's something that's it's documented at least, and I can share what I've learned here in Norway, right, and share with you and others who want to listen, because the more we understand about each other's point of views, and the more we understand about other people's experiences of climate change, how real it is, I think the better it will be. And I think we all have an obligation to do that.
It's interesting because you hear a lot about the cyclones in the Caribbean, and that affect the east coast of the United States, but I don't hear anything about major storms in the Pacific that might be causing massive flooding in the Pacific Islands. Mm-hmm. It just doesn't seem to register on the national stage.
Which is it's terrible, and it's also part of my PhD was also looking at Pacific climate leadership, and they're trying to be climate leaders, right? What does that entail? It really does entail to get up and step on and having to share what's going on in the Pacific with the rest of the world. So I think, luckily I've also seen in the last decade or so that even Norway and other European countries are much more focused on the Pacific now than what they were, and maybe in a different way than before.
What's changed?
I think maybe just political priorities, and also maybe realizing, discourse of climate change has also changed, and I think, it might just be a reflection of, obviously, like I said, political priorities, but I think also people are more realizing the actual effects of climate change, which is hopefully a good sign, because, the more we understand of our consequences of what we're doing over here, the better it is over there, right? So,
is there, in the Pacific Islands, is there a big sense of injustice in relation to climate change?
Yeah, there's been, now what we're seeing coming out of the Pacific region, and is really important, is levels of activism, and there's so many young people really getting together and to create a greater voice for Pacific Islanders, and especially young Pacific Islanders, and that sense of injustice definitely has influenced. I mean, it is a truly unjust situation, right? They get the biggest part of the climate change consequences, but then they're also the ones who haven't done they haven't, how do you say it?
They haven't lived in a way that's created the...
Yeah, so they're the least responsible, but see the greatest impacts, basically.
Yeah.
And the sense of that is just massively unjust. So we are seeing a lot of currents of activism going on, particularly driving that injustice, sort of motivated by that injustice. But now I'm thinking about, so we might also compare that to the nuclear testings that went on in the region in the 70s, which was sort of it's terrible. Like the Marshall Islands had nuclear testings, plenty of them, and what we're seeing now is a combination of that complete unjust situation where they were basically used as guinea pigs, and pulling parallels to that of climate change that we're seeing today. So there's definitely a lot of that sense coming out. Sorry, I had a particular idea, but it disappeared in the...
Doesn't it? How many people live in the Pacific Islands? Do you know?
Gosh, so there are about 22 countries and territories. No, I forgot. I'm sorry, because now I'm confused with how many people are also in PNG, which is a lot of. It's huge compared to the rest. No, sorry, I can't remember.
Doesn't matter. And the other thing I think you were looking at in your PhD was the different styles of climate diplomacy. So can you just tell us more about that? I imagine that's the sort of thing that you see in the conferences, in the UN conferences.
Yeah. So a reason for looking at diplomacy really is because it gives you a good insight into how to connect what is going on the ground with the global decision-making processes, such as, at the climate negotiations. And diplomacy is really, the practice of connecting on the ground to the international or the global. And diplomats are sort of ultimately the representatives of a place in many ways.
Mm-hmm.
So in a Pacific context, that actually means a lot, like we were talking about earlier, about having that connection to place and also having that experience. So, what is a Pacific diplomat then, with a very unique understanding of place and climate change experience. So that strong connection to land, which is very important in Pacific cultural identity.
As an Australian, I understand that, from the Australian Aborigines, they've also got, stories that are related to the land and a very, very strong connection with the land. So I imagine
exactly. Yeah, exactly. And also there's a lot of knowledge connected to that land, right?
Yeah.
So there are oral societies that have passed down stories about their land through generations, which is, again, this place-based knowledge that is unique for that area and provides a sense of belonging. And it's also defining kinship. So it's family. So you are your land, and the land is you, in a sense. And the connections between land, clan, or kinship and identity is still very strong. It's still very strong in many Pacific societies. And this is an essential aspect of Pacific life that sort of has to be taken into account if we are to understand the current situation of climate change and its impact. So, in the problem with climate change negotiations and the huge conferences is that in their attempt to sort of create these global mechanisms and these global documents for everyone, these climate conferences also have been argued to create these global kinds of knowledge again, so it's stripped away from its cultural significance, some have argued as well. And that means that these climate change experiences and cultural differences are not really expressed in international documents. Now, obviously, that's also the way that it has to be in that sense. If everybody was to sort of push their experiences and if everybody was to push their experiences and opinions into the documents, we wouldn't get anywhere, these. But there are some challenges with this, because that also in these negotiations, it's a very certain way of communicating, right? So you have this, I think it's called a language in between, the negotiation language in itself is sort of stripped from cultural significance, and you don't go into the experiences of climate change in that sense. And the challenge of this is that it's been hard for the Pacific delegations to sort of connect what is going on at the conference to what is going on back home. But also in a different way, connecting what is going on back home to these international conferences. So in a sense, it's also not giving other delegations and other people participating at these negotiations, it's not giving them an understanding of a Pacific reality of climate change. So even though, a lot in the media, the Pacific Islands have been very sort of popular as these, as victims, and sinking islands and a sort of this doomsday image, which also sort of strips them of agency in many ways, because that's also the important thing here, that they also do have a voice, they have agency, and they are using it. And when I'm talking about Pacific climate diplomacy, I'm guessing this is the way to push for that agency and make use of those climate change stories in these diplomatic settings where, you have to negotiate. If you want to negotiate the future of your island, you would want to draw on your expertise, and that is also very important to include in that expertise of actual climate change reality of living with that. So they've sort of countered this narrative of victims, and like I mentioned before, they really sort of want to stand up as climate leaders, and they define that in various sort of regional documents and treaties. And the way that they're doing that, at least on the UN climate negotiations scene, in many different ways. But I guess to give an example of how Pacific climate change or Pacific climate diplomacy looks like, I guess we would can look at COP23, which was the climate negotiations in 2017 in Bonn. And Fiji was the presidency, which is the first time a Pacific country has held the presidency for these negotiations. And it was really, it really showed that strengthened Pacific regionalism, although, Pacific held the front, but at least the aim was to really sort of get the Pacific voice on the international level. And it showed how, through developing this sense of Pacific diplomacy, they connected what was going on the ground with the global, sort of just making the place relevant, as it's been called by some. So, for example, the climate change opening ceremony was officially opened by a traditional Fijian kava ceremony. And kava is this indigenous plant that you drink, and the ceremony itself has highly cultural and deep-rooted historical significance. It's sort of a ceremony that binds the participants together and strengthens relations. And the Fijian presidency just had, they opened the conference with this. They had it all through the negotiations. I've seen Macron sit there with, a little kava bowl drinking. And also it's a way of, interestingly enough, it's also a way of creating a setting where the Pacific Islanders or the Pacific delegates are in control, right? So this is it's a very unfamiliar setting for Macron, I would guess, and everybody else, but they're the ones who sort of shaping the way that communication is ongoing. And what we've seen was that this has been ongoing. So they really work to sort of have that, the Bula spirits that they fronted a lot. But maybe more importantly, and that also goes to that sort of trying to shift how the system is, and also shaping ways of sharing knowledge. So the knowledge sharing practices was the introduction of the Talanoa facilitative dialogue, it's called. And that was made an official speaking format, the UNFCCC negotiations. So the facilitative dialogue was sort of a stock-taking exercise of the delegates coming, or not just delegates, but actually everybody coming together and seeing sort of where are we at in achieving our goals. And what Fiji did, and maybe the Pacific group more broadly, they pushed it as the Talanoa facilitative dialogue. And Talanoa is a very particular form of communication and means to speak and discuss and tell stories. So that's the really the key within the Talanoa is to share stories. And the way that they were doing this, sitting around the kava bowl, sharing stories about where we were at, how there were three very distinct questions, but sort of to sum up, it was sort of very where we were at in the discussions, basically your fears and concerns, and most importantly, it's also based on respect. So everybody has a chance to really just talk. As I saw a news article after they held the Talanoa, where it said, finally negotiators are talking like people, just because they were sitting there and just sharing stories in a way that hadn't been done before. So what that shows is really it's a way to take control over the knowledge sharing format, which is, in the UN negotiations, highly bureaucratized and it's very system heavy, right? But it's really sort of shaping it up. And it's also a very good opportunity to get others to connect to the Pacific in one way. The participants that did participate, so they get the sense of Pacific in a whole different way than what they maybe would have. But also, it's a very open format to speak in and share your stories and experiences. So it's quite interesting, and trying to shake those big systems that we are so used to, and that's the reason really why I think Pacific climate diplomacy in itself is quite interesting in the way that is currently being developed as well to get that on the ground connection with the international level. So
I think I just love that idea of bringing in. I mean, I imagine that it's not in the Pacific Islands, but it's in a lot of Indigenous communities all around the world, that there's the idea of how you make decisions and how you come together, how you share, how you make sure that everybody's heard, how you make sure that people have their stories, how you make sure that people are respected. And I think bringing that into an international conference is just mind-blowing. I mean, I think it's fantastic that they can do that, and to get people then to be exchanging on a completely different level about this huge thing that's impacting all of us. I think that's absolutely brilliant. It's wonderful.
Yeah. I think we have a lot to learn. I think that's a lot of maybe ways of communicating and forums, just the way that meetings are set up, and that if we maybe changed around a bit, that we have a lot to learn from each other in that sense, and maybe may also the climate negotiations have been ongoing for so many years, so maybe that's just what we need, right, to get somewhere to change the system as it is, because now it's so critical. Massive that,
and it's absolutely critical. I mean, there is nothing that is more important.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask you too about what it's like to be a woman in the climate change arena, as an academic, as an anthropologist. Have you had any particular experiences with the fact that you're a woman?
Well, I think it's being a woman in academia and in climate change and in the the way that I work, it's definitely sometimes experienced different sides of it that maybe a man wouldn't. I wouldn't know. But in academia in general, I mean, the way of communicating in the way that often your work and research is being discussed is, you present your research and then you are questioned or critiqued. So just that in itself can be somewhat challenging in ways. But also being a young woman in the sort of settings that I've been moving around in. So, for example, at the negotiations or in Brussels, and those kinds of forums where obviously it's often a very sort of male dominated scene, and often older men. I do and have experienced that it's difficult to take the word and to maybe express myself and be heard in that sense. Yeah,
it's hard to be the one who
and I guess
to stand up and speak, and there's a lot of other people who are speaking who are sort of dominating the conversation. It's hard to. Is that what you're saying? It's hard to get your word in.
Yes, and also, I mean, hierarchy in itself has its. Although I've worked with a lot of great people, men who have, completely trusted my abilities and sent me out and have complete faith in my abilities and want me to speak up. I've also, had the sense of I am a young scholar, still trying to, it's not easy to talk about, for example, anthropological research. It has to be quite, not everybody gets that. What are you talking about when you're talking about kinds of knowledge? Like we have different kinds of knowledge or levels, and I guess it's also maybe the curse of anthropology, because you're not, we do not have a straight up answer, right? The answer is also always, it's complex. We have to look more into it. We have to understand the whole thing. So that in itself, isn't always easy to get across. So, I guess also being a woman in academia and within climate change, I do have the desire to be heard. Like I really want to push myself to actually and challenge myself to take the word and to speak out. But I've also noticed that, on a personal level, sometimes it is scary, because sometimes, you do get that critique back, and sometimes that old man, brushes you off because you're just a young woman, haven't lived enough or don't know the system enough and things like that. So yeah, definitely sometimes quite some issues.
The thing that really strikes me is when you talk about how, as an academic, you're critiqued. You put up an idea, and then basically you're going to be judged and say, well, they're going to try to punch holes in what you're saying. And comparing that with what you were saying about the Fijian way of communicating, of respect and sharing and stories. There's such different ways of communicating. It's really
That's very true.
Striking. Yeah.
That's very true. Yeah. So, part of, I guess, being a social anthropologist is, one thing is learning about consequences of climate change in the Pacific and for Pacific peoples, but the other really sort of side of it is, how research is developed and how we understand this, and how other academics can have very different approaches and understanding. So personally, also, I think it's quite fascinating how we create knowledge based on others' ideas like that and critiques. So it is it's a very sort of what do you call it? Self-exploring discipline, I guess, in that sense. Because it's from comparison that we gain perspectives of ourselves, right? So
yeah. If you had one message that you wanted to say to the people who are listening to this, there's one thing that you'd really like to take away.
I guess it goes both to one thing to take away is to understand other people's views. What anthropology is amazing at doing and what fieldwork really allows you to do is to go in the field and to have genuine conversations and experiences, and to really sort of try to at least understand other people's point of views. Even if you're not necessarily always, agree to that, sometimes, it might conflict with her inner feelings and thoughts. But I think that, especially coming to climate change, if we're trying to understand other people on a more genuine way, I think we can also understand a lot about the current system in itself, why we got to this point where we are at, but also understand things about ourselves as individuals and the reasons why we do as we we do. So that's really, I guess, one of the main issues, and to have that level of understanding and to be genuine about it, because then it would be on a whole different level, actually. Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, I mean, I've learned so much in the last, just from talking to you about what anthropology is, what the reality is for the Pacific Islanders, what the reality is of going to the conferences, the reality of being a woman in the climate change context. And so just thank you very, very much for participating. And is your book coming out soon? How can people get hold of that?
It's available online.
Yeah.
The PhD is available online. But then I'm also now working on it's just a terrible work of chopping it up to pieces now, so making it into articles.
Okay. And what's it? So if people look up Camilla Borrevik online, and then is there a name for the PhD? Yes.
It should be available if you look up Camilla Borrevik on Google Scholar.
Yeah.
Then there'll be access to the PhD.
That's great. Okay. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Cecilia.
I hope you've enjoyed this episode of Brave New Women. On Friday, 22 January, I'll be holding a free webinar to talk about how women can stand up and speak up. There'll be 2 sessions, 8:30 a.m. in Paris, which is 6:30 p.m. in Sydney, and then the second session at 2:30 p.m. Paris, which is 8:30 a.m. on the US East Coast. If you'd like to join us, please connect on LinkedIn or on the Brave New Women Facebook page. Thanks so much for listening.